The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 1, Into the Primitive. Boy, Jack London doesn't waste any time giving us a wild and painful ride in this first chapter. I felt like I got whiplash the way he just yanked the story from one direction to the next. We're introduced to our hero, Buck. He's a 140-pound, 4-year-old St. Bernard Scotch Shepherd mix. He was born and raised on a vast estate in the Santa Clara Valley in Northern California, and he had the run of the place. There were other dogs on the estate, but none so admired or spoiled as Buck. I mean, he had the life. He lounged by the fire with the judge, the estate owner, hunted with the judge, escorted the judge's daughters on walks, played with his grandchildren, swam in the swimming tank, and chased other creatures on the estate who dared to enter his realm. This was a fine life for such a fine specimen. All that changed one day when the gardener's helper tricked Buck into coming with him, where he sold Buck to a dog peddler for $100, which is roughly $3,500 in today's money. Buck had the life, but now everything he knew was gone. A new kind of life, a hard, rough, painful life, awaited him. London's description of what happens to Buck is hard to read, which I guess means it was a well-written story. The stranger to whom Buck was sold treated him horribly. At one point, Buck mangled the man's hand and ripped his trousers from knee to ankle in his attempt to get away from the stranger. The stranger told another stranger, if given the chance to do this over again, meaning by Buck, he wouldn't do it, not even for $1,000 cold cash, he said, which is somewhere around $35,700 today. But the man got nowhere near $1,000. He only got $50. And so, in all, Buck was worth $150. $50 to him, $100 to Manuel, the gardener, which is about $5,300 in today's money. Eventually, Buck made it to his final stop, where he met his next tormentor, the man in the red sweater. Buck was ready to get his revenge for the way he'd been treated. Instead, whatever mistreatment Buck thought he'd experienced so far was nothing compared to what the man in the red sweater had in store for him. Every time Buck leapt to attack the man used his club to whack Buck in the teeth, head, and wherever the man could land his club. Buck and the man repeated this more than a dozen times. These attacks left Buck bloodied and exhausted, but he didn't want to stop until he got his revenge. After several more horrible beatings, Buck was done. Beaten, but not broken. He knew he had no chance with the man and his club. Buck was there for several days until one day, a French-Canadian named Perrault came and bought Buck and another dog called Curly. Perrault took them to a ship called the Narwhal. No, a ship named Narwhal, where Buck met another French-Canadian named Francois. He also met two other dogs, Spitz and Dave. Spitz was a treacherous dog, while Dave was quiet and kind of kept to himself. Eventually they made it to their destination, Dyea Beach, Alaska, and here Buck experienced snow for the first time. Chapter 2. The Law of Club and Fang. Oh my goodness, this is a violent chapter. I mean, more violent than the last one. We're told every hour was filled with shock and surprise. Every moment, life and limb were in peril. There was an imperative need to be constantly alert. Boy, London sets a pretty bleak scene for us. In this chapter, Buck learned 3 very important lessons for survival in this new land, and he also learned why he's there. First lesson. His first lesson he learned at Curly's expense. Curly tried to make friends with Spitz, and for that moment of weakness, Spitz mauled her nearly to death. The other nearby pack dogs finished her off. The narrator tells us Spitz fought like a wolf, strike and leap away. London's description of the attack and Curly's death is short, but quite disturbing. The attack disturbed Buck, too. He liked Curly, and he felt that Spitz ambushed her, and he hated Spitz for that. I think it's safe to say we know who the antagonist of the story is. Buck learned a lesson he carried with him for the rest of the story. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Second lesson. The second lesson he learned the first night in Dyea Beach. Santa Clara Valley didn't give him many opportunities to learn to sleep in the cold and snow, and it was really cold and really snowy. He tried laying on the snow, but soon started shivering. After several failed attempts at finding a warm place to sleep, he accidentally stepped on Billy, buried in the snow. Ah, yes, Completely bury yourself in the snow to stay warm. A small lesson. There was another small lesson Buck learned. Buck had to devour his food as soon as he got it, or the other dogs would eat theirs and then come after his. It took several meals where some of the dogs stole part of his rations for him to learn this lesson. The hard work and the small rations made him lose weight, and his nice, neat coat was a mess. His new job. You can probably guess why he's there. He's going to be part of a sled team. He didn't want to work, but he knew he shouldn't try to rebel. Like the man in the red sweater, Francois demanded obedience from his dogs. They added a new dog to the team named Solex. He was an old, battle-scarred husky whose name means angry one. Solex was a scary-looking dog that not even Spitz would mess with. Dave was the wheel dog, Spitz was the lead dog, and Buck was a swing dog. With the team completed, Francois, Perot, and the dogs can start their trek to Dawson in the Yukon Territory. By the end of the day, they made it to the mouth of Bennett Lake, 40 miles away. That sounds pretty good to me. This is the beginning of winter. There's probably 6 to 10 hours of daylight, maybe a little bit more. So that's about 4 to 8 miles an hour. Imagine pulling a heavy sled for that long and going that far. During this chapter, Buck also started finding animal instincts long dead from his domestication. He found his ability to fight like a wolf, like what he saw Spitz do to Curly. I would say this chapter lived up to its description at the beginning of the chapter. Chapter 3, The Dominant Primordial Beast. So is Buck going to become some kind of dominant primordial beast in this chapter? Okay, so the first sentence actually answers my question. There is a dominant primordial beast inside Buck, and with the fierce conditions of the trail life, it grew and grew. London implies Buck does become beastly, but then he tells us Buck was so preoccupied with adjusting to his new life that he avoided fights with other dogs. In this chapter, the group makes it to Dawson and then starts back to Dyea Beach, but Buck is forced to fight for his life several times. Fight 1. Unlike Buck, Spitz has no problem fighting other dogs, including, and especially Buck. One night, Buck left his warm resting place to eat, and when he returned, that treacherous Spitz had taken up residence in his spot. Buck sprang at Spitz with a fury, which startled Spitz because, until now, Buck had avoided fighting. Buck and Spitz started circling each other, ready to rumble. But, Fight 2. Suddenly, a pack of 4 or 5 starving huskies came into the camp, using Buck and Spitz's fight as cover to try to steal food. These dogs were just skin and bones, desperate for any food. Perot and Francois saw the dogs and started clubbing them, trying to drive them out, but the huskies managed to get into the grub box and eat the food. All of the team dogs sprang out of their nests at the discovery of these huskies. Buck fought off 3 huskies, and the other wild huskies attacked the other dogs. During the attack, Buck got in touch with the animal instincts he didn't even know he had, and he used this newfound fierceness to fight off the huskies. During this fight, Buck felt a pain in his throat. One of those huskies must have gotten hold of his neck. No, wait. It's that treacherous Spitz. Instead of fighting the invaders, he took this opportunity to take out his rival. The other team dogs decided to run for their lives. Buck, seeing the other dogs running, started behind them. He looked back and saw Spitz running after him, but eventually Spitz was more concerned with survival, and he stopped going after Buck. The 9 dogs took shelter in the forest on the other side of the lake. These dogs were badly injured, some seriously, with torn throats, lost eyes, chewed ears. At daybreak, they limped back to the camp to find the invaders gone, along with half their food. The men were so happy to see the dogs and tended to their injuries. But with so many miles left to go and not enough food, the men couldn't delay in getting the camp packed and the wounded dogs off on the trail. Fight 3. This fight was against the elements rather than another animal. The 30-mile river was not frozen like so much of the rest of the environment. As a result, there were many times that either Perot or some of the dogs went through the ice. One time, all of the dogs up to Buck fell through the ice. Buck, Dave, and Francois strained to keep from going in too. Later, a little further down, the rim ice broke away and there was a frantic attempt to save everyone. Francois and Perrault managed to pull the dogs and the sled up the side of a cliff, with Francois the last one up. They found their way back to the river and set up camp. They managed to only go about a quarter of a mile that day. Later, they made it to Hootalinqua with no more danger like the previous days. It took 6 days to run the 30-mile river. After this, they managed to go 110 miles, all the way up to Five Fingers. Fight 4. The next fight happened when Dolly went mad. She started panting and frothing at the mouth and came after Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad before, and she chased him with a type of madness that instilled sheer terror in Buck. She chased him to near exhaustion. Just before Dolly managed to get to Buck, Francois used his axe to stop Dolly. Fight 5. Of course, Spitz, being the revolting animal he was, saw the state Buck was in thanks to Dolly, and knew this was his opportunity. Spitz sprang at Buck and twice tore into him without any resistance from Buck, because Buck was breathless, exhausted, and helpless. Francois stopped Spitz, but it wasn't easy. For Buck, this meant war, and Buck was determined to be the lead dog. Oh, but he wasn't going to fight Spitz for the lead dog position. No, he was going to work to turn all the other dogs against Spitz. This leadership spat continued all the way to Dawson. Dawson. The team made it to Dawson and stayed there for 7 days before leaving to return to Dye Beach in Skagway. By now, Buck had destroyed the team's solidarity. The dogs regularly mistreated Spitz. Buck wouldn't go near Spitz without snarling. The dogs fought each other too, except for Dave and Solex, who just kept to themselves and didn't care about anything else. Francois had a really hard time keeping these dogs working together as a team. Fight 6. The final fight of the chapter happened one night at the mouth of Tahkeena. That night, Dub found a snowshoe rabbit, but then he lost it. The whole team went after it, along with 50 Huskies from the Northwest Police Camp. Buck, of course, led the pack of dogs and started to feel a bloodlust. He knows this creature is his, and he can already feel the joy of the kill. Spitz pursued the rabbit too, but in a different direction, allowing him to snatch that rabbit in a second before Buck got it. This was the last straw. Buck didn't care anymore about that darn rabbit. Spitz got the rabbit, but Buck was going to get him. Buck hit him shoulder to shoulder in that moment. Like with the rabbit, this encounter was to the death. Spitz may have been a veteran fighter, but Buck had his newfound primordial instincts, and that made him a formidable foe. Like any good fight story, the underdog, that's Buck in this case, starts out losing to Spitz, injuring Buck numerous times while being untouched himself. Buck was dripping with blood by now, and he knew the other dogs were waiting to pounce on the loser. Again, like any good fight story, Buck suddenly found the strength and cunning he needed. Buck breaks 2 of Spitz's legs and then crashes into him shoulder to shoulder, sending Spitz flying backwards. The circle trounced. Buck was victorious. He was the dominant primordial beast. Chapter 4. Who has won to Mastership? Since the chapter title is a question, does that mean Buck doesn't get to be the lead dog? In this chapter, Buck demands what he believes to be his rightful place as the lead dog, and the team makes it back to Dawson, but there's no rest for the weary. Rightful place. Francois and Perrault are not aware of the fight, but they figured it out after seeing Buck's wounds and Spitz's absence. They figured that Spitz must be dead, and that this meant no more trouble for the team. Yes, let's look on the bright side. No more trouble. Not, gee, I wonder what happened to Spitz. When the men started hooking up the team, they put Solex at the lead position. This makes sense, considering the respect he garners and his experience. But Buck disagreed. He killed Spitz. The lead position was his. Buck kept pushing Solex out of the lead position. Eventually his persistence forced Francois and Perrault to relent, and give him the opportunity to prove he is a lead dog. And prove it he did. He excelled at making the other dogs live up to their jobs. With Buck in charge, the team solidarity came back. I mean, it was kind of his reason for the split in the first place, but the trail was better going back than on their way to Dawson. Unlike the last time they encountered the 30-mile river, it was now coated with ice, and they covered it in one day. They made it back to Dyea Beach, and it was a record run, with each day, 14 days in total. They had averaged 40 miles. Perrault and Francois were celebrating their speed run. Other mushers were in awe of these men. No time for rest. There was no time to celebrate for the dogs, though. Francois and Perrault had new orders that didn't include the dogs. Francois said goodbye to Buck, and he wept over Buck. And that was the last of Francois and Perrault. The dogs were now needed to take a mail train to Dawson. The dogs just got back from Dawson, and now they have to go back there. Buck and the team joined a dozen other dog teams to make up the mail train. This run would be different than the last. With Perrault and Francois, the sled was lighter, but the mail sled was very heavy. And each day was the same. Up at the same time, cook breakfast and eat at the same time, break camp and harness the dogs, set off on the run an hour before dawn, make camp at night, feed the dogs after camp is made. For the dogs, this was the only good feature of the day. They got to loaf around after their fish was eaten. Now, of course, Buck quickly showed his dominance with the other dogs. The hard, heavy work took its toll on the dogs. By the time they made it to Dawson, they were much skinnier and in poor condition. Rest and recovery was not allowed, as they stayed just 2 days in Dawson and then headed back to Skagway. Dave. With 1,800 miles traveled since the beginning of winter, their strength went down, even with the driver's care and tending. The dogs were all suffering terribly, but Dave the most. Something was wrong with him. Whatever was wrong with him, the drivers weren't able to figure it out. Dave insisted on staying in the traces and run with the team until he literally couldn't do it anymore. The driver stopped the train, carried Dave away. Then a gunshot rang out. The driver hurried back to the train, and they continued. The dogs knew what happened to Dave. Chapter 5. The Toil of Trace and Trail. They've already run the trail to Dawson and back with Francois and Perrault, and then again with the mail train. They already know the trail. Is this title warning us that the trail is going to get harder? 30 days after setting off to Dawson with the mail train, they made it back to Skagway. Oh my gosh, these dogs are in such a state at this point. Buck lost 25 pounds to a very lean 115. That's like a 16% loss. That's a lot to lose in 5 months. Many of the dogs were in pain, and most of all, they were dead tired. They ran 2,500 miles with only 5 days rest for the last 1,800 miles. Back in Skagway, Buck and his team were too tired to keep running the mail train. Luckily, they weren't chosen to run the mail train anymore. Unfortunately, they were sold to a trio from America. The trio, Charles, Hal, and Mercedes, were sloppy and slovenly. Their tent was half-stretched, dishes unwashed, and everything was in disorder. Buck knew from the start that these people were not prepared and not disciplined, and he didn't trust them. They carried too much stuff, failed to pack the sled properly, chatted too much while loading the sled, argued too much, didn't start early enough in the day, stopped too early at night, and failed to make the run at all on some days. London does a good job describing how unprepared these three are for the trek, and we can see that this is going to be a very hard time for Buck and the team. Hal is in charge of the dogs, and he has no idea what he's doing. He was quick to punish the dogs with a whip. He didn't even try to encourage them or earn their respect like Francois, Perrault, and the mail drivers did. He just beat them. Since the sled was too heavy, Charles and Hal thought it would be a great idea to get 6 more dogs, so now they have 14 dogs in total. In addition to not being able to manage the trail runs, they also didn't know how to manage the dog food. They had too many dogs now, and Mercedes and Charles kept sneaking food to the dogs after their rations. This meant it was inevitable that the food would run out. I guess we can see the reason for the chapter title now. Hal had discovered that half the rations were gone, and they've only gone about a quarter of the distance, and there was no way to get more food. By the time they got to Five Fingers, the dog food had ran out. The trio were miserable and suffering, but not once did they consider the suffering of their dogs. Buck suffered through all of this nightmare. He staggered at the head of the team. His beautiful coat now hung down, matted with dried blood from Hal's whippings. His muscles had wasted away, and his ribs were showing. The dogs were suffering so great that some started dying. First to go was Dub, and then the 6 new dogs. Next was Billy the good-natured. He fell and he couldn't get up. On the next day went Kuna. The 5 that were left were in a really bad way. Joe was too far gone to be malignant. Pike was crippled and limping and no longer able to malinger. Solex, one-eyed from the attack of the starving huskies, was so weak he could barely pull the sled. Teak had not traveled as far as the others, so he was beaten more because he was fresher. Buck was too weak to keep the trail, so he stopped enforcing discipline. By the time they made it to White River and John Thornton's camp, the dogs were falling, Mercedes was crying and refusing to walk, Hal was swearing, and Charles was near tears. Thornton told him not to go on the White River because it was thawing, but of course, the trio didn't take his advice. Hal, as usual, started whipping the dogs to get them moving. At first, none of the dogs wanted to get up, but eventually they did, except for Buck. Buck refused. He had a bad feeling, and he was just so tired. He was not getting up, no matter how much Hal beat him. Thornton grew angrier and angrier the more Hal beat Buck. Eventually, he said, as he choked up, "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you." Hal tried to fight back, but Thornton got the best of him. So Hal cut Buck from the traces and left him with Thornton. Thornton examined Buck for broken bones. Luckily, he was just heavily bruised and terribly starved. The trio and the last remaining 4 dogs left, limping and staggering, pulling the sled from the bank and down to the river. Buck and Thornton watched the sled go out about a quarter of a mile when the ice gave way. The back of the sled went in, Mercedes screamed, and they saw Charles turn and make a step to run back. And then the whole section of ice gave way, and dogs and humans disappeared. "You poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand. Chapter 6. For the Love of a Man. The title implies that John Thornton was good for Buck, and in turn, Buck was good for Thornton. This chapter is probably the most pivotal chapter since Chapter 3. In this chapter, Buck is able to recover from his many months on the trail from Skagway to Dawson. He also grows to trust and love Thornton in a way he'd never done with anyone before. He showed his love and devotion for Thornton several times in this chapter. For the first time, Buck felt real, genuine love. Even with the judge in Santa Clara Valley, Buck didn't feel this kind of love. Thornton liked to take Buck's head in his hands and rest his head on Buck's. He would shake Buck's head back and forth while calling him names. While there, Buck could hear a call from deep in the forest. He was curious about this call, but he didn't want to leave Thornton. Buck wasn't the only one that needed recovery. Thornton was traveling with 2 other men, Hans and Pete. In the previous December, Thornton's feet had frozen, and so Hans and Pete left him there with 2 other dogs, Skeet and Nig, to recover while they continued on. The men were to return later with a raft. When Hans and Pete returned with the raft, Buck just tolerated them because Thornton liked them. Buck loved Thornton, and he was very loyal to him. So much so that he would do anything Thornton asked, and Thornton knew it. One day, the men and the dogs were sitting on a cliff 300 feet above ground, and for some reason, Thornton got Hans and Pete's attention and then commanded Buck to jump. Buck didn't hesitate. He started to jump, but the 3 men managed to stop him. This blind loyalty to Thornton was good, but it was also bad. At Circle City, Buck attacked a man at a bar who had a mild spat with Thornton, where the man pushed Thornton. The local miners didn't punish Buck for this attack because they thought it might have been provoked. Later on in the fall of that year, Buck had to save Thornton's life. The group was boating down a rough part of the rapids at 40 Mile Creek. At one point, everyone was on the bank, except for Thornton, who was trying to move the boat down the creek and shouting directions to the shore. Thornton fell off the boat at the worst part of the rapids. Buck didn't hesitate and went into the water after him, but he was sucked into the water and nearly drowned. Hans and Pete managed to pull him out without Thornton, but Buck went back in. This time he was determined to do it right. Buck reached Thornton, and with the help of Hans and Pete, they pulled him out of the water. Buck was lifeless, and Thornton was bruised and battered, but they were still alive. They camped there for the night before heading to Dawson. In the winter at Dawson, the group rested, and the men enjoyed some time at bars. One day at a bar, Thornton was listening to a bunch of men bragging about their sled dogs. Thornton, feeling the excitement of the moment, declared that Buck could pull a sled weighing 1,000 pounds. This was really not a smart thing for Thornton to do because, one, he had no idea if Buck could do it, and two, neither he, Hans, nor Pete had any money to put up for a bet. After Hans and Pete put up everything they had, and Thornton managed to convince a friend to help him, the bet was set. Now it's on Buck to save Thornton from this foolish bet. Thornton put Buck's head in his hands and shook it back and forth, as he had done so many times before. He called Buck names and whispered to him, "As you love me, Buck. As you love me." Thornton stepped back and told Buck to go. Buck struggled, but he did what Francois had taught him. He jerked here and there, giving slack in between. After several attempts to pull the sled, it broke out. "Now mush!" commanded Thornton. The sled swayed and trembled, half-started forward. Buck did it. He managed to pull the sled, with Thornton running behind him. The man and his dog celebrated with each other. Chapter 7. The Sounding of the Call. In this chapter, we're told Buck was hearing the call from deep in the forest. The title tells us this call becomes more than Buck can ignore. In 5 minutes, Buck won $1,600 for Thornton and the others. That's somewhere around $57,000 today. The men could now pay off their debts and take what was left and go east and look for the legendary Lost Mine that supposedly had gold nuggets unlike any seen in the Klondike. Thornton, Pete, and Hans, with Buck and a half-dozen other dogs, set out to the east on an unknown trail to find what so many others could not. For weeks at a time, they would travel, and then for weeks they would camp, where the dogs loafed and the men panned for gold. The months came and went. When spring came again, they decided to stop looking for the lost cabin and to just stay there and work. They worked every day and found thousands of dollars in gold. There was really nothing for the dogs to do except for haul meat that Thornton killed. Buck could still hear the call from deep in the forest. Sometimes Buck would go out into the forest looking for what, he didn't really know. But his love for Thornton always brought him back. One night he went into the forest and came face to face with a wolf. Buck was much bigger than the wolf, and it ran at the sight of him. Of course, Buck followed him. After some time, the wolf was sure Buck wasn't going to harm him, but he still remained kind of cautious of Buck. They ran for hours, and Buck was so happy. He knew he was finally answering the call he'd been hearing. Then Buck remembered Thornton and returned to the camp. For 2 days and nights, Buck never left the camp, never let Thornton out of his sight. But after 2 days, he couldn't resist the call anymore, and he took off into the forest. But he couldn't find his wild brother. He started staying out longer, for days at a time, eventually for weeks, searching for the wolf and the call. He would fish and kill other large animals for his food, including one injured bear and a healthy moose. The moose was harder to kill since it was healthy and originally with a herd. It took 4 days of chasing and attacking, but he managed to kill it. And he was proud of himself. He was cunning like a wolf, intelligent, and now his experiences have made him as formidable a creature as any that's roamed the wild. Something's wrong. After weeks in the forest, Buck's newfound senses told him there were people in the area that he had not noticed before. He sensed that something was wrong. He found a fresh trail that led back to Thornton's camp. He returned to the camp, picking up speed as he went. As he neared the camp, he noted the forest was silent. Animals were in hiding. At the camp, he found Nig, laying on his side, dead with arrows in both sides. While inspecting the camp, he saw some Yeetats who were dancing and singing in the wreckage that was the camp. Buck was enraged. With no hesitation, he raged at them one by one, tearing at their throats in a frenzied attack. The Yeetats were so tangled together that they accidentally shot each other with arrows. The surviving Yeetats fled into the woods. Buck returned to the desolated camp. He found Pete killed while he was sleeping. Skeet was in the water. Then Buck caught the scent that would throw him into a depression. There, hidden in the water, was John Thornton. We're told Thornton's desperate struggle was fresh written on the earth, and Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of the deep pool. All day, Buck brooded by the pool and roamed restlessly about the camp. He knew Thornton was dead. This loss left him with a great void that ached where nothing could fill it. For days he stayed with Thornton. The call. From far away, the call came to him, stronger and more compelling than ever before. With Thornton gone, he was ready to finally obey the call. There was a wolf pack that crossed into Buck's valley. When the wolves first encountered Buck, they were in awe of him. He stood so still and so large. The pack came after Buck, but the lessons he learned, don't let them get behind him. There's no fair play. Fight like a wolf, helped make him stronger than they were. After taking down several wolves and tiring so many more, his wild brother approached him. Now the call came to Buck in unmistakable sounds. Buck ran with the pack, side by side with his wild brother, yelping as he ran. His new family. Soon, the Yeetats noticed a change in the breed of the timber wolves and told of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They were afraid of the ghost dog. They saw him as more cunning than they were. He would steal from their camps in the fierce winters, rob their traps, slay their dogs, defy their bravest hunters, and kill their hunters too. In the summers, Buck would come back to where Thornton died to mourn him. Buck would sit for a while, then let out one long, mournful howl, and then leave. Buck was finally where he belonged, running and leaping at the head of the pack, in the pale moonlight or the glimmering borealis, singing the song of the pack.